Hello, I'm Denise Carvalho-Silva and I work in Open Targets. Today I'm going to show you how you can take a rest from manual searches using our API. This is part of the EMBL-EBI training webinar series. So the objectives for today, I will tell you a little bit about Open Targets, the Open Targets Consortium. I'll show you where you can find the documentation on our REST API. I will move on to some examples on how you can query our REST server, and towards the end, I will wrap up the webinar. So, Open Targets is a public-private partnership that wants to transform the way that drug discovery is performed, and we want to do so through the systematic identification and selection of targets. So at the moment, we've got 5 partners. Takeda joined us this week, so welcome, Takeda. And besides Takeda, we've got GSK, the EMBL-EBI, the Wellcome Trust Sanger Institute, and also Biogen. So all of those partners working together with this vision of transforming the way that drug discovery is done. So we would like to transform drug discovery by allowing this systematic identification of targets through several ways. And one of the ways that we want to allow for that is by performing associations between targets and diseases so that you guys can test or generate therapeutic hypotheses. So in Open Targets, we go about linking targets and diseases, and this is performed based on a huge range of data sources. So the Open Targets platform provides you with the associations, and everything you see in the platform is data-driven. So this is our data model there. So we've got targets coming from Ensemble and UniProt. So we use Ensemble gene IDs as proxies for drug targets. And we also work on diseases and we fetch them through the EFO. So EFO is an ontology. It's the experimental factor ontology. So it's the system that provides us with a standard nomenclature and hierarchy for diseases. So those are the 2 main entities within the Open Targets platform. And in order to make the association between them, we rely on data, we rely on pieces of evidence coming from any of those databases highlighted here. So this is as it stands. So those different data sources from the EBI, from Sanger, from NCBI as well, they are used in order to allow us for the associations. And this is how it stands as per our last release, which is December 2017, and the numbers of data sources and data providers are very likely to increase in the coming releases. But this is how it stands at the moment. And each of those data sources, they provide a different type of data. So for example, UniProt, the GWAS catalog, Gene to Phenotype, Genomics England, they provide genetic information so that we can make the link between targets and diseases. We also have pathway information coming from SLAP-Enrich or react on. So we look for pathways that are affected, and we rely on that information to make associations based on affected pathways, and so on and so forth. So there are several different data types here, and each of them are classified in a different way. So how we go about processing this data? So we rely on public databases out there, and they provide us with generic data. So they provide us with information on the target or gene, information on the disease, also pathways, and so on and so forth. And they also give us what we call the JSON files. So those are a summary. It's a document that summarizes the data that Open Targets needs in order to make the association between target and disease. So we are not replicating every single piece of data that those databases contain. So we pick and choose the information that is relevant to us so that we can go about making the association. So once we gather this information, we get the JSON files from our data providers. So the JSON files are part of our core data. So this gets fed into our data processing pipeline. We also validate the input. So we make sure we run quality controls and assessments in order to make sure that the data we get from the public databases are ready to go and ready to be processed. So then we can carry on to our next step, which is to analyze the data. And by analyzing the data, we mean by ranking the data, by scoring the data as well. So we rely on different data sources, and they will be scored differently as well. And we make sure that the data is also in accordance with our data model here. So once this is processed and we reach the final stages of our pipeline, we then store this, the data and the associations. We store them on Elasticsearch, and this is available for everyone. And the most important thing as well here is that we support private data as well. So there is a snapshot of our pipeline on Elasticsearch. So you're more than welcome to include your own private data. So perhaps your data is not quite it's not quite ready to be published, but you want to perform some analysis with that data first. So if you've got them, if you've got your data as a JSON format, you can simply run our pipeline and incorporate your data into our analysis as well. So you may wonder, how does this JSON file or JSON summary document looks like? So this is an example coming from GWAS, from the GWAS catalog. So we work very much in collaboration with all of those data providers, so that they can give us the pieces of information that are relevant to us. For example, we want to know the gene ID for a given target or the EFO ID for a given disease. We also highlight whether or not there are any papers for those genes or diseases, so that information is also captured in our JSON file. We also highlight the type of curation, whether or not it's manually curated, that piece of evidence. And then we give more details on the evidence itself. And we look into factors such as the sample size for the given evidence, also what is the confidence value for that evidence. So for example, for the GWAS evidence, so they curate papers using, and they look for the p-value for that reported association. So that is reported as well in our JSON file. and also we compute an association score for this given SNP, for example. So this is the information that is captured in the JSON file. And it varies depending on the data source that we rely on. So once the data is computed and it's stored in Elasticsearch, we then make the results of our pipeline available, and this can be done via the REST API, which is what I'm going to focus on from now on. But the data is also available for access through our online platform. So the online platform was released 2 years ago, so it was in December 2015, and the API, the first release, took place a few months later than the user interface. So both of them have been around for around 2 years, and they are free and open for everyone to use. And this is just to highlight how you can get to our user interface. So it's the online version of the platform. So it's targetvalidation.org. And the API, the REST API, is available through this URL over here. So before I focus on the REST API, I just want to highlight that neither the graphical user interface nor the REST API are the only ways of accessing our data. So we've got also the batch search and we've got the data dumps. So this pretty much depends on how much data you want to get out of open targets. If you've got just one disease or one gene that you want to search for, perhaps the graphical user interface is the best way to go. So it's nice and easy. There are very nice, funky visualizations there. And it's very easy to go through the different workflows using the graphical user interface. However, if you've got many targets, if you do them on a one-by-one case basis, that will take much longer. So we also provide what we call the batch search tool, where you can enter up to 200 targets, and very quickly you can get all the diseases associated with those targets. You can get the pathways that those targets are enriched. You can get the drugs that targeted those genes, and you can get graphical visualization of the interactions between those targets. So the batch search is a good tool if you've got a reasonable size of targets, such as up to 200 targets. However, if you want to get hold of the entire data sets that we've got in open targets, so the best way to go forward is to use our data dumps. So that's the fastest way, and you can get hold of all of our data. But if you want to get almost our data, but not quite everything, the REST API is the best way to go. And this is what we are going to focus from now on. So before we start, we need to know where is the REST documentation for the Open Targets API. So if you are coming from the Open Targets platform, so you just look on the right corner, the top corner of your browser. So there is a link there called API. You can click on that link and you can then select our API documentation, which will look like this screenshot over here. So our documentation is based on ReadDoc, and it's a 3-panel design. So it's very easy to use the documentation for the Open Targets API. So you can select the endpoint here that you're interested in. So let's suppose I'm interested in the endpoint called Get Association by ID. So I click on that and I can get the URL for this endpoint, and then I can access the data using that URL. So at the moment we've got in Open Targets, we've got the get and the post methods for data access. So again, it depends if you want to do more complex queries. So you are better off using the post methods. But the good news is that we tailor for every single need there. And we also provide a summary of what this endpoint provides. So here, the get association by ID, you need to know what is the ensemble gene ID of your gene of interest, and you also need to know the disease ID for your disease of interest. And once you know those two IDs, you can simply paste them into this URL, and then you can get the association from Open Targets with the score and other pieces of information as well. So these are some of examples of different calls that we provide. So let's suppose, I think perhaps the best way to start with our calls is with the public search endpoint, and this endpoint is actually particularly useful if you don't know the ID of your disease or you don't know the ID of your gene of interest. So you just type in asthma or any other disease, or maybe you can type in a gene name that you are interested in, or different gene names as well if you want to. And then, for example, let's say DMD or SOX3, BRCA2, and then we will return to you the ensemble gene ID for that HGMC symbol, such as BRCA2. And then another example is the association filter. So let's suppose I'm interested in this gene and I want to get all the associations which are based on indirect evidence. So there are parameters here that I can adjust to my needs. I can also choose which fields I would like to display in my results, such as I would like to include the EFO label, so the EFO ID for my diseases, and I want to restrict this query to up to 100 results. So by default, we show 10 results only. So if you want to adjust this, the size of your results, you just include the size equals whichever number you are interested in. So we support up to 10,000 results being retrieved in one call. We also have this example of an evidence endpoint, and again with filters that you can pick and choose what you want to get from this call. So again, here I'm interested in getting the evidence for the gene, this gene here associated with that disease, and the evidence I'm interested in is just the one coming from the Expression Atlas resource here, the ABI. I'm interested in retrieving up to 100 results, and I'm also interested in getting these results retrieved as a JSON format. So we support different formats. So JSON is not the only one. We do have XML, we have CSV, and tab delimited as well. So those different formats, especially tab delimited and CSV, they are great ways for people who are not very confident with programmatic access. So it's basically you change the format to tab, and you are gonna download a file that can be it's very easy to open in a spreadsheet, for example. So it's important to highlight at this point that the REST API is not just for bioinformaticians. You don't need to know any programming languages to access our REST API. So we have put together a series of tutorials and use cases as well on how one can access our REST API. So I do encourage you guys to have a look at our blog post to see some examples. So it's just some flavor on how you can go about using the REST API. So I would like to break down the URL of the OpenTarget REST API. So this is an example here. It looks very complicated, so it's worth breaking this down into smaller chunks. So first of all, we've got the server. So this is the address of our server for the OpenTarget REST API. And then from there, we move on to the endpoint parameters. So we've got several endpoint parameters available for our users. Some of them are public, others are private. And we've got, for example, the association filter. We've got the search, so public /search. We've got evidence filter, association by ID, evidence by ID, and so on and so forth. So those are the endpoint parameters. And then finally, in the very end of that huge URL, we've got other parameters that can be very much required, or they are actually optional. So that information on whether it's required or optional, it's on our API documentation. So again, here, I've got the ensemble gene ID, the size. Again, remember, our limit is up to 10,000 entries being returned. And again, the fields that I may want to get in my results as well. So how can you query our REST server? So there are several ways that you can do so. The simplest way, especially for those who are not programmatically inclined, like myself, we can simply paste those URLs in any location bar of internet browser. If you are familiar with the terminal window, you can also access our REST endpoints on the command line. You can also call our endpoints from your own application or workflow. So perhaps you've got an application already connecting different REST APIs. So you may just want to connect our endpoints to some of yours that are already in place. So you're more than welcome to do so. And we also provide free clients that can talk to our REST API. So if you know Python or R, so OpenTarget does provide two clients, the Python and the R client, that you can use them in order to talk to our REST API. And the beauty of the Python client is that it gives you some flexibility. So for example, you can pick and choose which data sources are used for the association score computation. So I'm going to go through a few examples here on how you can run those REST endpoints. So the first one, you can simply paste that in your browser, as I did over here, so you can get the results there for you. Of course, this is not particularly human-friendly, but at least it can give you an idea whether or not the call is working. So if it's not working, before you incorporate that into your workflow, you can simply you can try to troubleshoot there and then using the browser. If you've got a plugin added to your browser, such as JSON View, so this becomes more human readable. So again, it's quite colorful, and again, you can collapse or expand the options here. And then this, you can already try to make sense of the results from your browser as well. And remember, you don't need to know any programming skills at this stage. You get the URL from our documentation, you paste it into your browser, and you can download the data and perform your downstream analysis if you wish so. If you are familiar with the command line, yes, you can simply access our endpoints with a command such as curl, and then you can get the data from the command line. And we also have the clients, as I said earlier, free to use. We maintain very much the Python client, and it's very flexible. And as I said, you can even work around and pick and choose which data sources you would like to take into account in order to compute the score. We also provide the R client, and we no longer maintain this client, but it's on GitHub, and we very much welcome your pull requests. So yeah, if you want to contribute to that client, and please feel free to do so. So now I will just highlight a few comparisons between using the web interface and a REST endpoint. So the REST endpoint can easily mimic what we do on the online web interface. So let's suppose I'm interested in the P10 gene, so I can either go to the platform and I'll find out there are 32 results for P10, and this is the endpoint that replicates the search that I can do using the online version of the platform. So I can search for a gene name, I can search for a disease name, I can search for a drug compound, or I can search for a phenotype. So all of those will give you results. So here with the REST API, I can see there are 32 entries being retrieved when I search for P10, and it can also give me the ensemble gene ID for this gene, which I did not know to begin with, and also it provides all the diseases that are associated with this gene of interest. The other thing that I can do, so again, in the browser, I will get a heat map listing all the diseases that are associated with P10. So the latest version of our database shows 674 diseases. And this is the endpoint, the REST API call that will mimic the association table that I can get from the browser. So here we are, I've got a total of 674 diseases, and I can get the association score for each of the data sources. So remember, we've got several data sources out there. If they are similar data sources, they will be combined into larger data types. So everything that is genetic related will be combined as a genetic association data type, and we compute individual scores for the data types and also for the data sources. So that information is very easy to get from the REST API. And this is just an example to retrieve the associations for this gene. And I want to focus in this case on the associations that are based on direct evidence. So I use the filter direct equals true. Then I can use the get association by ID. So let's suppose I want to find a little bit more about the association between neoplasm and P10. So I know from the previous endpoint that the association, that actually the EFO ID for neoplasm is this one here. So with the get association by ID endpoint, I pop in the ensemble gene ID, the disease EFO ID, and then I can focus specifically on that entity, on that pair of disease and target. And finally, I also I would like to show you the Get Evidence filter. So let's suppose here in this other example, I'm no longer interested in neoplasm, rather I'm interested in this Momo syndrome, and I can see from the website that there is just genetic evidence for this association, so we don't have anything else. And I've got 5 pieces of evidence actually used to make that association between PTEN and Momo syndrome. So the REST API endpoint for this to retrieve such information is the evidence/filter. I pop in my target ID and then my disease ID. And here we are. So I've got a total results of 5. So those are the 5 pieces of evidence used for the association. They all come from the Genomics England data source of ours, and we provide the score as well. And for each of those single piece of evidence, we provide an evidence ID. So you can also query our REST API with the evidence ID as well. So we have an endpoint called Get Evidence by ID. So again, you can incorporate that into your workflow if you want to. So just going back again to the documentation, just to highlight that we've got the public endpoints, which are very much supported and maintained by us on a regular basis, but we also provide what we call the private endpoints. So this is just a summary of them. So you can get the disease by ID, or you can get enrichment analysis that we've carried out, especially for the bad search tool. So that's available through a post endpoint, but those are under the private umbrella of endpoints. So they are used by our user interface, by our online version of the platform, and they serve our external data. So they are not part of our core data. And they are subject to change without notice. So that's why we offer them as private endpoints. So please explore all the different categories of endpoints that we provide, especially like under utilities. You also you can get some statistics as well on our latest releases. And there is a lot here for you to explore. And again, just a reminder that we do provide both get and post endpoints. And just towards the end now, I would just like to tell you guys that actually our website, the online version of the platform, is very much powered by the REST API. So in whichever page you are on our targetvalidation.org, you can actually find the REST endpoint or the REST call that gives you this association table here. So you can, again, just copy this information and include that in your workflow. And the bad search is a very good example of a post endpoint. So here's the results of my bad search tool. So I searched here for 30 targets or so I can get an enrichment of the diseases where those targets are associated with, and this information can be replicated with a REST API call as well. So this is very much what I would like to cover. I would like to wrap up the course now just by saying that Open Targets relies on public data, which is available out there. We integrate this data, we assess the data, we score the associations as well. So we add value to the data that we retrieve from different databases. This data is free to use, is free to access. There are several different ways that you can access our data. Even if you are a bioinformatician and you don't look at web interface, please have a look at the Open Targets platform, the online version of it, because it helps understanding the workflow of our data, and it also provides some nice visualizations as well. But as a rule of thumb, there are 4 different ways that you can access Open Targets data, and the way to go forward depends very much on how much data you want to extract from our databases. So we provide this for free. It's open so that you can generate your own therapeutic hypothesis. And we also, Open Targets ourselves, we also rely on this information to generate our own data. And we combine the data that is already there with the evidence that we are generating as I speak. So we've got collaborators within Open Targets, especially at the Sanger and GSK, working, and now Takeda, working in the lab, creating new data in a handful of therapeutic areas. So as soon as this new data using CRISPR-Cas9 organoids, RNA sequencing, so as soon as this data is created and checked for quality and assessed, we'll make this available through those public databases, and we will also integrate the data that we generate. We integrate it in our platform for you to access our analysis. So the platform is out there. It is very much in place to allow systematic identification of new drug targets, and also to allow you to select and prioritize targets for your drug discovery journey. We rank the target and disease associations based on the different sources that we currently rely on. So different sources will be scored differently. This information is also integrated at the target and disease level, so you can find a profile for the targets and a profile for the diseases as well. And we do provide, in addition to the REST API, we provide this very intuitive graphical web interface. So here I just show the latest stats on our December release. So there is, there are loads of different types of data there, and if you want to get hold of the millions and millions of associations or the millions and millions of pieces of evidence, so the best way to do so is through our data dumps. And just a reminder that everything is 100% free to use. So if you ever use Open Targets, or if you want to know more, please have a look at our paper on nucleic acids research. So this was selected as a breakthrough article, so I really encourage you guys to get more information from our paper. And with that, I would just like to say a big thank you to all my colleagues within Open Targets who have been putting together this amazing resource and allowing for different users to access that information via the API and also through other means. And with that, just to tell you that you are more than welcome to contact us if you want to give us suggestions, or if you get stuck with the API, or you don't know which endpoint is the best option for you, or how to perhaps include your private data into our pipeline. So just get in touch. There are several ways that you can do so, and I also have some tutorial videos as well available on the website, on the online version of the platform. So please have a look at those videos as well. So with that, just to remind you that this Open Target REST API webinar is part of a series of EMBL-EBIs. There is plenty more to come, so just keep an eye on their website, and there is a huge list of other REST API webinars that was run by my colleagues at EMBL-EBI training team. So with that, once again, thank you for joining this webinar. I hope it was useful for you. And I'll just say thank you so much again for joining us, and I'm happy to take questions. Thank you.